You've heard the line before, maybe so many times it almost slides past you without landing. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And at first glance it can sound clean, tidy, motivational in the way quotes often are. But when you sit with it while your body is moving, when your breath is a little heavier, and your mind finally has less room to run, it starts to feel less like a slogan and more like a mirror. Because you are not what you intend to do. You are not what you promise yourself you'll start tomorrow. You are not what you do on your best day, when the energy is high and everything lines up. You are what you repeat, and you know that already, even if you don't say it out loud. You feel it in the quiet frustration that shows up when you realize how automatic your days have become. You feel it in the strange gap between who you imagine yourself being and who your routines quietly shape you into. Most of your life doesn't happen in big moments. It happens in small, almost invisible choices. The way you get up, the way you avoid something uncomfortable by reaching for something familiar, the way you tell yourself a story about being tired or busy or not ready yet. None of these moments feel like identity. They feel harmless, they feel forgettable. But repetition has a way of adding weight to things that seem light in isolation. When Aristotle says, "We are what we repeatedly do," he's not talking about judgment. He's talking about gravity. Repetition pulls you somewhere whether you notice it or not. You don't wake up one day and suddenly become disciplined or distracted, grounded or scattered. You drift there, slowly, quietly, through patterns you barely remember choosing. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, in a useful way. Because if excellence is not an act but a habit, then excellence isn't about a heroic surge of effort. It isn't about the day you finally feel motivated enough to overhaul your life. It's about what you practice when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. It's about the version of you that shows up on ordinary days. When the novelty is gone and the resistance is familiar, you know what autopilot feels like. It's that sense of moving through your day while your mind is somewhere else. Doing things because you always have. Reacting instead of choosing. Autopilot isn't lazy. It's efficient. It saves energy. And that's why it's so powerful. But autopilot doesn't care where it's taking you. It just keeps going in the direction you've already pointed yourself. Choice, on the other hand, takes effort. Awareness takes effort. Not a dramatic, exhausting effort, but a steady, attentive one. The kind that asks right here, right now, what am I actually doing again today? Not what do I want to do in theory, but what am I repeating? There's a moment sometimes when you catch yourself mid-pattern, mid-scroll, mid-avoidance, mid-excuse, and for a second, there's a flicker of clarity. That flicker isn't comfortable. It doesn't feel good. It feels exposed. It feels like seeing yourself from the outside. And the instinct is to shut it down quickly, to distract yourself, to tell yourself it doesn't matter. But that flicker is important. That's awareness breaking through habit. Discomfort shows up there too. Not the sharp kind, but the dull, persistent kind. The kind that tells you something is off. You're not broken when you feel that discomfort. You're informed. Discomfort is information. It's your system letting you know that what you're repeating doesn't match what you care about. Most people try to numb that signal. They label it stress or burnout or lack of motivation. But often it's simply the friction between habit and intention. You don't need a lecture to know this. You've lived it. You've had stretches where your habits aligned with who you to be and life felt simpler, even when it was hard. And you've had stretches where they didn't, where everything felt heavier than it needed to be. The difference wasn't a single decision. It was what you kept doing when no one was cheering. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. That line strips away excuses and fantasies at the same time. It means you don't need to wait for a perfect moment to become someone else. And it means you can't hide behind one good day and call it growth. It's grounding and it's demanding in a quiet way. As you move right now, notice what you're practicing. Not in a self-critical way, just honestly. Notice how you talk to yourself when things get hard. Notice where your attention goes when you feel tired. Notice what you do again and again without thinking. This isn't about fixing anything yet. It's about seeing. Because you can't change a habit you refuse to look at. And here's the part that often gets missed. Habits aren't just behaviors. They're ways of responding, ways of thinking, ways of avoiding or engaging. You practice patience or impatience. You practice presence or distraction. You practice courage or delay. Over time, those practices become familiar, then normal, then invisible, until one day you realize you've become very good at something you never meant to. The good news and the responsibility is that repetition works both ways. The same force that quietly builds patterns you don't want can build ones you. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, through small repeated acts of awareness. Through choosing, again and again, to stay with discomfort instead of fleeing it. Through doing the simple thing you said mattered, even when it doesn't feel impressive. You don't need to become excellent today. You need to notice what you're rehearsing. Because every repetition is a vote, not for who you wish you were, but for who you are becoming. And once you see that clearly, you're no longer stuck on autopilot. You're awake, and being awake even briefly changes what's possible. Once you start seeing your life this way, as a series of repetitions rather than a collection of intentions, something subtle shifts. The pressure to reinvent yourself all at once eases, and in its place comes a quieter, more honest question. What am I actually practicing right now? Not what do I admire? Not what do I post about or talk about or plan for? What am I rehearsing with my time, my attention, my energy? Because practice is honest. It doesn't respond to your self-image. It responds to your behavior. You can believe you value focus, but if you repeatedly fragment your attention, you are practicing distraction. You can believe you value courage, but if you repeatedly avoid uncomfortable conversations or decisions, you are practicing retreat. None of this makes you weak. It makes you human. Habits form because they work, at least in the short term. They protect you from discomfort. They conserve energy. They keep things predictable. The problem is that predictability can slowly replace aliveness. Days start to blur together. You can't quite point to what's wrong, but you feel a low-grade restlessness, a sense that you're busy but not fully engaged. That's often not a crisis of purpose. It's a crisis of repetition. Your life is doing exactly what you've trained it to do. When Aristotle says, "We are what we repeatedly do," he's pointing to identity as something lived, not declared. Identity isn't who you think you are when you're imagining your best self. It's who you are when the choice is boring, when the reward is delayed, when the effort feels small and unacknowledged. Identity is built in the quiet, uncelebrated moments. That's uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that one big decision will, you. But it's also freeing because it means you don't need one. Think about how often you wait for motivation, as if motivation is a prerequisite for action, rather than a result of. You tell yourself you'll start when you feel ready, when you have more energy, when things calm down. But readiness is often the byproduct of habit, not the. You feel capable after you've been showing up, not before. You feel clear after you've practiced clarity, not before. This is where people get stuck. They mistake discomfort for incapacity. They feel resistance and assume it means something is wrong. But resistance is often just the sensation of interrupting an old habit. Your system is used to one pattern, and you're asking it to learn another. Of course it feels awkward. Of course it feels tiring. That sensation isn't a stop sign. It's a signal that you're doing something new. Discomfort, again, is information. It tells you where the edge of your current habits are. It tells you what you haven't practiced yet. Most people spend their lives trying to eliminate discomfort, not realizing they're also eliminating growth. If excellence is a habit, then discomfort is often the doorway into it. Not extreme discomfort, not suffering for its own sake, but the mild, persistent unease of choosing something unfamiliar over. As you move, as your breath settles into a rhythm, notice how your body handles repetition. Muscles don't grow from one effort. They grow from consistent stress followed by recovery. Miss enough sessions and the adaptation fades. Do the work repeatedly, and the body changes without asking permission from doubts. Your mind works the same way. Attention strengthens where you place it. Patience grows where you practice waiting. Confidence forms where you repeatedly keep small promises to yourself. There's grief in this realization too if you let it in. Grief for the time spent practicing habits that didn't serve you. For the years you thought you were stuck, when really you were just well trained in certain patterns. That grief doesn't mean you failed. It means you're finally seeing clearly. And clarity is the beginning of choice. Choice doesn't always feel empowering. Sometimes it feels heavy, because once you see that your repetitions matter, you can't pretend they don't. You can't tell yourself the day didn't count. Every day counts, not because it's dramatic, but because it's cumulative. The weight of your life is built ounce by ounce. But here's something important. Habits don't demand perfection. They demand consistency. Missing once doesn't undo anything. Repeating over time does. The danger isn't slipping. It's drifting without noticing. Autopilot is what turns small slips into long patterns. Awareness interrupts that drift. So when you catch yourself today or tomorrow or next week, doing the thing you said you didn't want to keep doing, don't turn that moment into a verdict on who you are. Turn it into a data point. You're seeing your training in action. And seeing is power. Seeing means you can adjust. Not dramatically, just slightly, one repetition at a time. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. It means excellence is quieter than you imagined. Less glamorous, more forgiving. It's not about proving anything. It's about practicing alignment, about letting your actions slowly catch up to your values, about becoming trustworthy to yourself, not through intensity, but through repetition. You don't need to overhaul your life. You need to pay attention to what you're already rehearsing, because you are becoming very good at something right now. The question isn't whether you're training, it's what you're training for. There's a moment that happens when you really let that question land. What am I training for? It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, sometimes with a little ache in your chest, because you realize how often you've been training for relief instead of meaning, for comfort instead of growth, for numbness instead of clarity. And again, this isn't a moral failure. It's a human response to pressure, fatigue, uncertainty. You learned these habits because at some point, they helped you cope. But coping and becoming are not the same thing. When you're mentally tired, habits take over even more aggressively. Your brain wants efficiency. It wants familiar paths. It wants to conserve energy. That's why change feels hardest when you're not because you're incapable, but because your system is trying to protect itself. And this is where self-respect starts to matter more than self-criticism. Because the goal isn't to fight yourself, it's to guide yourself. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. It reframes what strength actually looks like. Strength isn't white-knuckling your way through a single moment of discipline. Strength is returning again and again to the same small behaviors even when they don't feel inspiring. Strength is choosing the slightly better repetition when no one is counting. Think about how often you underestimate the power of small things. 5 minutes, one decision, a single pause before reacting. These don't feel like identity-shaping moments, but they are. They're the brushstrokes that eventually form the picture. You don't become scattered because of one distracted afternoon. You become scattered because distraction becomes your default response to discomfort. And you don't become grounded because of one calm morning. You become grounded because you practice returning to yourself over and over again. There's a particular kind of honesty that comes with seeing your habits clearly. It strips away fantasy. It removes the comfort of blaming circumstances alone. Yes, your environment matters. Yes, your past matters. Yes, your responsibilities matter. But within all of that, there is still repetition. There is still choice. Even if the choices are small, even if they feel constrained, especially then. And this is where people sometimes misunderstand the quote. We are what we repeatedly do doesn't mean you are trapped by who you've been. It means you are constantly being shaped by what you do next. Identity isn't fixed, it's practiced. Every day you rehearse a version of. Some days that rehearsal is conscious, most days it's not. Awareness is what turns rehearsal into intention. And intention doesn't have to be loud. It can be as simple as noticing when you're about to do the thing you always do, and asking yourself if that's really what you want to practice again. You don't even have to change it every time. Just noticing already weakens the grip of autopilot. Autopilot thrives on speed. It rushes you past reflection. It tells you there's no time to think, just react. Awareness slows things down just enough to create space. And in that space you regain authorship. Not over everything, but over something. And something is enough to start. As you move through this moment, through this workout, through this stretch of effort, notice how repetition feels in your body. The first few times are awkward. Then there's a rhythm. Then there's a quiet competence that shows up without announcement. That's habit forming. That's excellence growing roots. It's not dramatic. It's reliable. The same is true in the rest of your life. The conversations you avoid don't disappear. They become habits of silence. The thoughts you rehearse become your internal climate. The standards you quietly accept become your baseline. None of this happens because you decided to settle. It happens because repetition always wins over intention. If intention isn't, there's also compassion here if you let it in. You don't need to shame yourself for past habits. You needed them at some point. They carried you through something. Thank them for that. And then recognize that what once protected you might now be limiting you. Growth often begins with outgrowing strategies that kept you safe. Excellence isn't about never slipping back. It's about returning more quickly. It's about shortening the distance between awareness and adjustment. The more you practice noticing, the less time you spend lost in patterns you didn't choose. Over time, that alone changes your life. You may not feel excellent, you may feel tired, you may feel behind. But excellence, as Aristotle frames it, isn't a feeling. It's a pattern, and patterns can be reshaped. Not through force, but through repetition guided by awareness. Right now, you're already doing something hard. You're staying present, you're listening. You're moving your body while letting your mind slow down instead of speeding up. That's a repetition. It counts. Not because it's perfect, but because it's intentional. So don't ask yourself who you should be someday. Ask yourself who you're practicing being today. Because whether you realize it or not, you're becoming someone through. And once you see that clearly, excellence stops being an abstract ideal and starts being something you can touch, one habit at a time. There's a quiet tension that builds once you start thinking this way. Not panic, not urgency, just a steady awareness that time is passing and patterns are forming, whether paying attention or not. That tension doesn't need to be resolved immediately. It needs to be honored, because it's the tension between who you are by habit and who you sense you could become by practice. Most people try to escape that tension. They drown it out with noise, with entertainment, with busyness. They tell themselves they'll deal with it later, when life slows down. But life rarely slows down on its own. It speeds up unless you intervene. And intervention doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as choosing not to rush through the next moment on autopilot. We are what we repeatedly do. That line becomes heavier the more you sit with it, because it means you can't outsource your identity to your intentions or your circumstances. It means your days are quietly voting on your behalf, and those votes add up. You might notice resistance when you think about changing what you repeat. A voice that says it's too late or too hard, or that small changes won't matter. That voice is familiar because it's part of an old habit too. A habit of minimizing your agency, of lowering the bar to protect yourself from disappointment. But that voice isn't truth, it's just practiced. Habits of thought are some of the strongest ones you have. The way you interpret effort, the way you explain setbacks, the way you label yourself when things don't go as planned. If you repeatedly tell yourself you're inconsistent, you practice inconsistency. If you repeatedly tell yourself you always quit, you rehearse quitting. These narratives don't describe reality, they shape it. Changing those narratives doesn't require lying to yourself. It requires accuracy. You don't always quit. You quit sometimes, you're not inconsistent. You're consistently practicing certain patterns. That shift in language matters because it keeps the focus on behavior, not identity. Behavior can change through repetition. Identity follows. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. It doesn't ask you to be extraordinary. It asks you to be consistent with what you value, even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't feel like it. Feelings are weather, habits are climate. You don't build a life around passing moods. You build it around repeated actions. As fatigue sets in, both physically and mentally, this distinction becomes, when you're tired, you can't rely on inspiration. You rely on what you've trained. If you've trained avoidance, that's what shows up under stress. If you've trained presence, that's what carries you through. Training happens in calm moments as much as in hard ones. Every repetition is preparation for a future version of you. You might wish you had started earlier. That's another common habit. Regret disguised as reflection. But wishing doesn't alter the pattern. Practicing does. The only moment that can actually change your trajectory is the one you're in. Not because it's special, but because it's real. Notice how your body responds to repetition now. There's a point where effort stops feeling like a question and starts feeling like a fact. You don't debate whether to take the next step. You just take it. That's what habit does. It removes friction. And that's why habits can either imprison you or free you. They reduce the need for constant decision-making. They automate behavior. The question is what you're automating. Automation isn't the enemy. Unconscious automation is. When you consciously choose what to repeat, habits become allies. They carry your values forward without requiring constant effort. They make the right thing easier, not harder. But that only happens if you decide what you want to practice before you're. And this is where kindness toward yourself matters. Not indulgence, kindness. Indulgence avoids discomfort. Kindness stays with it. Kindness understands that building new habits while mentally tired is slow work. It accepts imperfect repetition as progress. It values return over perfection. If you miss a day, that's information, not a verdict. It tells you something about your capacity, your environment, you can adjust. Habits are flexible systems, not rigid rules. They evolve as you do. The deeper you go into this, the more you realize that excellence isn't about doing more. It's about doing less better more often. It's about reducing the gap between what you say matters and what you practice. That reduction doesn't require intensity. It requires honesty and patience. Right now, in this moment, you are practicing something. Endurance, presence, commitment. Even listening is a habit. You could have tuned out, you didn't. That's not nothing. That's you choosing what to repeat. So keep asking yourself gently but clearly, what am I rehearsing? not to shame yourself, to orient yourself, because direction matters more than speed. And repetition determines direction more reliably than any single act ever will. There's a subtle relief that comes when you stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be consistent. You feel it when you let go of the fantasy version of yourself who never struggles, never hesitates, never gets tired. That version doesn't need habits because that version doesn't exist. The real you does. The real you needs structure not as a cage, but as a container. A way to hold your intentions steady when your energy wavers. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. It tells you that who you are is not decided in moments of intensity, but in moments of repetition. That can feel almost disappointing at first. You might want a breakthrough, a dramatic shift, a clear before and after line. But what you actually get is something quieter and more durable. You get a life that slowly begins to match what you care about, not because you forced it, but because you practiced it. There's a certain humility required to work this way. You have to accept that change will be slower than your imagination wants and than your doubts predict. You have to accept that you'll repeat things you don't like before you repeat. You do. And you have to accept that awareness doesn't eliminate struggle, it just changes your relationship to it. When you're aware, struggle stops feeling like a personal flaw and starts feeling like part of the process. You stop asking, why is this so hard, and start asking, what am I learning about myself here? That shift alone conserves energy. It keeps you from wasting effort on self-judgment and frees it up for, think about how often you try to reason yourself into better behavior. You make arguments, you set rules, you lecture yourself internally. But habits don't respond well to lectures. They respond to repetition and environment. They respond to what's easy, what's familiar, what's available. That's why so much of life runs on default settings. Defaults are powerful. They decide what happens when you're not thinking. Awareness lets you redesign defaults, slowly, not by controlling every moment, but by nudging patterns in a different direction. You don't need to win every internal debate. You need to reduce how often the debate even happens. When a behavior becomes habitual, it stops requiring willpower. It becomes part of who you are, without you having to argue for it. This is where people often underestimate themselves. They think they lack discipline, when what they really lack is aligned repetition. They think they're inconsistent, when they're actually very consistent at practicing certain responses. You are not bad at habits. You're excellent at them. You just haven't always chosen them consciously. There's something empowering about reclaiming that truth. It means you don't need a new personality. You need new repetitions. It means you don't need to become someone else. You need to practice becoming more of who you already value. As your body keeps moving, notice how repetition creates trust. You trust a muscle because it shows up when you ask it to. You trust your breath because it finds its rhythm. That trust is built through use. Self-trust works the same way. You trust yourself when you repeatedly do what you said you would do, even in small ways, especially in small ways. Broken trust with yourself doesn't come from one failure. It comes from patterns of ignoring your own intentions. Rebuilding it doesn't require grand gestures. It requires showing up again and again in ways that are boring enough to be sustainable. That kind of trust is calm. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes how you move through the world. Excellence as a habit also reshapes how you think about success. Success stops being a finish line and starts being a direction. You don't ask, did I arrive? You ask, am I practicing what I value today? That question is answerable on any day in any condition. It doesn't require perfect circumstances. It requires honesty. You may notice impatience rising as you think about this. A desire for faster results, clearer proof, immediate payoff. That impatience is another habit too. A habit formed in a world that rewards speed and visibility. But depth is built differently. Depth comes from staying with something long enough for it to change you. And that takes time. Time is not your enemy here. Unconscious time is. Time spent repeating things you didn't choose is what drains you. Time spent practicing alignment, even slowly, gives energy back. It feels different in your body. Less frantic, more grounded. There's also courage involved in choosing habits deliberately. Because once you choose what to repeat, you're also choosing what to stop. You're choosing to let some things fade. Old comforts, old excuses, old identities that no longer fit. That can feel like loss even when it's growth. Let yourself feel that. Let yourself acknowledge that becoming someone new means saying goodbye to parts. Your past self, not with resentment. With gratitude, they carried you this far. Now you're choosing a different direction. Right now you don't need to decide everything. You just need to notice what you're practicing in this moment. Presence instead of escape. Effort instead of avoidance. Awareness instead of autopilot. That's a habit, and habits compound. You are not behind. You are not late. You are exactly where your repetitions have brought you. And from here, with awareness, you can begin to guide them somewhere else. Not through one act of excellence, but through the quiet power of habit.